Well, I think Parliamentary Review does something very interesting. It provides a platform for people to share and express their views, and I hope we're going to be able to build on that even more so that people can interconnect with each other. But it also gives an opportunity for parliamentarians to know that people are taking interest in what they're doing and how they're doing it.
Hello and welcome to the Parliamentary Review podcast, the podcast that pays attention to leadership. I'm Jonathan White, and in each episode I'm joined by directors, CEOs, CFOs, government ministers, chairmen, presidents, maybe one day even the Prime Minister of Israel. That is if they can decide who it should actually be. And you thought our hung parliaments were bad. The aim is to discover who these people are, the people who get up each morning and make Britain work. We analyse everything from the Bank of England's latest interest rates decision to the changes in the market for satellite television, and of course the innovation and success in the country that make it all worthwhile in the end. We also get their take on the current political and economic state of the country. Later in this episode, you'll have the chance to hear our exclusive interview with Lord Plunkett, former Home Secretary, former Education Secretary, and of course, current co-chairman of the Parliamentary Review. But for now, we're joined by Mark Bates, the CEO of RDT. RDT creates some of the UK's most widely used insurance software. If you've ever bought insurance or made a claim, there's a good chance their software was involved somewhere along the line. Mark is the driving force behind all of RDT's major innovations, its business practices, and even its office culture. Mark co-founded RDT in 1991 with the goal of developing innovative software for the insurance industry. Let's see how successful he's been. Mark, welcome.
Hi.
Thank you very much for joining us today. Now, perhaps I thought it might be a quite a nice place to start off. Perhaps if, in a few sentences, you could give the listeners some background to RDT.
Yeah, sure. I mean, we were set up a long time ago now, in 1991, and we basically write software for the insurance industry.
Now, I think, as I said in the introduction, obviously, the company in that time, the technology that has changed in your sector, let alone everybody else's, is almost incomparable. How on earth have you found it as a company being able to keep up with what has become a staggering change in technology since the early 90s?
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, that has been our biggest challenge. So, I mean, it's also the greatest thrill of what we do as well, because insurance is not considered the most interesting thing in the world, but the technology behind it has changed really dramatically, from most people going into a broker, sitting down with somebody, going through the things, letting the broker find the best quote for them, to what we see now, which is people being able to use their mobile phones, get prices back, compare them, select purchase, pay as you drive insurance. The dynamics have changed dramatically because of technology, and I think that will just continue to accelerate, actually.
Oh, without a doubt. And I think the story I remember, and the firm itself, is, of course, developed one of the first websites where customers could buy insurance from a selection of providers, if that's right.
Yeah, so back in 1995, we had, I think it was the first website you could buy motor insurance online.
Fantastic.
Yeah, and and we've kind of continued in that vein ever since, really.
And obviously, since then, the company's come on leaps and bounds. I think it was a few years ago you won the Excellent Model Insurer Analytics Award for your data orchestration platform. Now, it's described as being the first truly agnostic system. For those out there, and I'm sure there are many like me, for some of this is a foreign language. Would you mind explaining some of that in a bit more detail for us?
Okay, so this was a platform that we developed to enrich information about the customer. So if if you're getting yourself insured, the insurer really needs to know as much about you as possible, and they could spend hours and hours asking you all of that information. Nobody has the time for that, so the reason it's agnostic is we will use any number of different providers and sources of data that the insurer wants us to use, and we will go and get the data from all of those relevant sources, compare it, and then use that in the rating process or the claims handling process to analyse the individual.
Without perhaps going into the technological side of the market, before we do that, obviously RDT's fantastic growth over the years, over the last almost 30 years, can't come without clearly an internal culture. How would you describe the company in that regard?
It's changed a lot, to be honest. So we've always had a very close-knit culture, I think, because when we started, there was only three of us, and we were friends, and that kind of vibe, if you like, has remained as we've grown. So we're up to about, I guess we're probably about 130, 140 people at the moment, and keeping that is always a challenge, but the way we work these days is very agile, so for anybody who's not particularly au fait with that term in terms of IT, the guys girls work in small teams, and they are largely independent groups. They work often on bigger projects, but they're self-managing teams, and there's a really good atmosphere, and it creates all sorts of conversation, and we have very laid-back environment, which encourages people to communicate as best they can.
Clearly a winning strategy from, I know you didn't say it, but I'm sure you don't mind if I will, from starting above a chip shop to working with, it was in Australia. So what a way to go. But in terms of perhaps looking more broadly at the sector, Mark, what would you say at the moment, especially in the medium term, are the main challenges that the market's facing?
Well, I think in terms of the insurance sector itself, so there's various challenges. From a technical point of view, which is the one I'm probably best placed to comment on, is it's the explosion of data and the way that is managed. So that comes with risks and opportunity and challenges. So the opportunity for the insurer and in fact the customer from a pricing point of view is that the better the insurer understands you as an individual and therefore you as a risk, and whatever it is you're insuring as a risk, the more accurately they can price, and that benefits people who are good honest citizens. If you have a claim and it's a perfectly valid claim, not only will that get settled more quickly, but also it won't affect you as much because it's just one of those things. And technology helps the insurer assess that much better these days. The risk for insurers is that if they're not on that curve, they're going to be selected against really quite quickly. So if I know that this chap over here is potentially not a good risk because I can see something about him that concerns me, I can quite subtly alter the price that person will be quoted. Another insurer will then get that business, and they won't see anything strange in the fact that you've quoted a few pounds more than they have, but it will be enough to move that customer that they don't want into you.
So very much really a technological arms race at times.
It really is, yeah.
And speaking on that point, actually, it's a very relatable point, I think. Obviously, it's all very well and good the technology keeping up, but of course you need the actual human beings to have the skill set to be able to handle it. How have you found and whether it's changed over the years would be interesting to know. In terms of recruitment, in getting the right people, especially perhaps British people, with the right skill sets to work for you.
So, yeah, I mean, we find it difficult. There's no doubt about that. And we do rely on people from literally all over the world. And we don't have enough talent coming from internally at the moment. So we've been quite proactive, I think, over the last few years. So we've set up a couple of programs with local schools. There's definitely a lack of females who are working in this space. So we've got we work with several girls' schools and mixed schools as well. But we're encouraging. We go. I have people from our HR department that go to recruitment fairs and talk at schools and things to encourage and tell people, you know, the benefits of being in the industry. And they sometimes sort of play. It's quite often when we're working in agile teams for a bit of entertainment and learning, we will have games like building a bridge out of matchsticks, or you know, to encourage teamwork. So we will take games like that to some of these places, give people an insight into the kind of benefits of, you know, working productively as a team together, and the sorts of things that they can expect from working in this sort of environment. And it works really well. And so we're starting to see a steady stream now of pupils who are GCSE level, A-level level. They come and work for us in the summer holidays. Perfect. Then they go to university and so on.
I think you've hit the nail on the head, Mark. This is a type of skill that if you're not exposed to it from a relatively young age in the education system, it's something that is very difficult to perhaps pick up later, even to show any interest in it. And I think that certainly, I do ask most guests perhaps a bit of an unfair question, but if you were, say, Secretary of State for the day and you had a magic wand and you could ignore the civil service and Parliament, imagine that, and introduce a policy that would help the sector, I dare say an education one regarding this set of skills would be a good one.
I think so, yeah, for sure, because, you know, there are so many skills, associated skills as well. So it's not just developers. Not everyone wants to sit and write code, but analysing people's business processes. How can we streamline things? You know, if you can see something over here that works really well on your iPhone or your Android device, how could we translate that to make somebody's life easier over here? You know, there are many associated professions around other than just developers. So business analysts, we have people like Scrum Masters that organise the teams and make sure if they're blocked in any way, they can't develop something because this hasn't happened or this piece of information isn't available. They clear those blockages and keep those teams running smoothly. So there are loads of really interesting professions in this space that people don't know anything about. And it's, you know, but we as employers then have to go looking for people with generic skill sets and sort of and then try and make them correct.
Yes.
Absolutely right.
Have you noticed in the decades you have been doing this, have you noticed a specific another country that does get this right, where perhaps you've recruited more from there than perhaps some others?
The Asian continent, I would say, is one of the main areas that we find good quality developers coming from. So there's, India. We have some extremely good testers, developers, product owners from India. We've also had people. We've had a number of developers come from Europe, actually, but I would say Asia typically. Chinese are seem particularly good as well.
An awful lot of lessons to learn from.
I think so.
Yeah. And in fact, looking at the future, obviously there are myriad challenges that I don't think we could even begin to think of over the next 10 years. What do you identify at the moment? I can't help but feel with things sort of like cloud development that's going to change the market, perhaps in a positive way, perhaps, but maybe in a challenging one.
So I think the cloud in general is going to have quite an impact. Where currently huge percentage of companies still have the majority of their systems that they rely on operating in-house, on premises, and as that shift starts to happen, companies start to move their solutions into the cloud. They no longer need people to look after those systems in terms of the hardware and the day-to-day running of them. That starts to transfer away. So there will be a shift, I think, in people will need to be reskilled. Jobs will start to change. I mean, I always personally see these things as opportunities, but I think companies out there will start to see that happening more and more.
Now, I suppose it would be remiss of us if we didn't talk about it, but the current political situation in the country is fairly interesting, probably, fair to say, would you say?
It's interesting.
Perhaps the way to tackle it, actually, is in this way. Obviously, about 3 years ago, we had a certain referendum, and I'll try not to use the B word, but we had a certain referendum. And the problem is, over 3 years later, there has not been a conclusive end to that result. And speaking to a lot of people, I get the impression in all sorts of different markets there is uncertainty, that there is a frustration, that there is uncertainty and no conclusion. Have you found this to be one of the major frustrations from a business point of view, Mark?
I think we've been quite fortunate in that we are largely, at a day-to-day level, insulated from it because our main market is in the UK, and we also have customers out in Australia as well. So we do not have a large, we've got customers in Ireland, but we do not have a large presence out in Europe. So we're not experiencing as many issues as others. However, the uncertainty of the situation is having an impact, I think, just in terms of general business confidence, and because some of our customers are multinationals, they're not just executing on projects in the same way that they might if that certainty was there, I think.
And if it were up to you, Mark, how would you like to see this concluded in perhaps the most beneficial way for yourselves?
To be honest, I think at this stage, it's just disappointing that both sides haven't been able to find a resolution of some form, because I think usually as a group, people are stronger together. You need to have people be able to do what they want to do, but I think it's unfortunate that the situation has remained unresolved. You expect negotiations to go down to the wire, but we don't even seem to be getting particularly close to an answer. I'm not sure we've seen a last twist yet.
Lord Blunkett says in the interview that comes up after this, Mark, that Britain has often been blessed over the decades of when times get tough, we do have a leader that comes out. And maybe for the last couple of years, that's not been necessarily true. And our political world and our politicians certainly could learn a lot from the business world.
Yes, I'm not entirely convinced that once you're where you are, you have to negotiate with whatever you have, and I'm not sure that. I think one of the big issues was the deal that was brought back wasn't then accepted, and for me that's the frustration. Whether you believe we're stronger as part of Europe or you believe that we can be stronger out of Europe, the bottom line is that deal was important, and the thing I find frustrating is that the deal that was brought back got rejected, and I'm not saying it wasn't rejected for good reason, but it's just the fact that nobody seemed to know that it was going to keep getting rejected. I'm not quite sure. Yes, and I'm not quite sure how a deal was negotiated that no one was going to accept. So I think that is the frustration from a business's point of view, really.
I think what might be interesting, and obviously we're speaking at a time before the EU Council meets in October, which will really be the day that the European Union will officially offer something different, if at all. And if the government is able to bring back, which they say they want to do, essentially a very similar deal, but without the Northern Ireland backstop, I think it's at that point, if that's put to the House of Commons, and MPs, whether they are on the very Brexiter side of the argument or the very remaining side of the argument, if they can't compromise on that, I think there will be a collective sigh in the country, and maybe more than a sigh.
I think that's correct. Because at that point I don't know where it leaves everybody, to be honest.
Precisely. Now, perhaps it might be nice, I'm conscious of the time here, Mark, if we finish off, we were talking about the importance of education earlier. What would you say to young people that are looking for a career with the skills you need? What would you say, and you do this, obviously, you go into schools, what do you say to them, and what advice would you give them?
Well, I think, first of all, I think the career can be incredibly dynamic. A lot of people think you might just be sitting at a desk all day in front of a computer. That really is not the case. The world is moving more quickly than ever before in terms of everything, really, because the ability for computers to analyze data, we're using that to make things more efficient. So it's a fantastic environment to be in, to be honest, because it never stands still. So if you believe that you would like a job in this environment, what I would say is if you're interested in any area of technology, read about that, learn a little bit more about it, talk to people at the local schools and see whether or not they can help with that as well, and if they're running courses or let your passion take you, because there are loads of companies out there looking for talented people, and there's not enough good people out there, so you're not going to meet any resistance if you love what you do and you're passionate about it. They're key things. It's not even necessarily technical ability that's the key thing here. So if you're passionate, then I think that's the key driver at this point.
I think sound advice. Mark, thank you very much for joining us today.
You're very welcome.
I hope you all enjoyed our chat with Mark, and especially learning more about the challenges facing the sector and how the whole team at RDT are continuing to raise standards. If you haven't heard it before, coming up now is our conversation with the Parliamentary Review's co-chairman, David Blunkett. Lord Blunkett served as Home and Education Secretary in Tony Blair's cabinet before receiving a peerage in 2015. Outside of politics, he's the Vice President of the Royal National Institute of Blind People and the National Alzheimer's Society, and when he has the time, he can be found cheering on his team, Sheffield Wednesday. I hope you enjoy listening as much as I enjoyed speaking to David. Here it is now. We're now joined by Lord Blunkett. Thank you very much for joining us.
You're very welcome.
Now, it would probably be remiss of me if I didn't start, given the recent events in Parliament. I didn't ask you, given your 32 years in that place,
about your thoughts regarding the unprecedented situation I think the public are looking at the minute.
Well, I think I see it very much like Joe Public. I see it as though I'm looking at something that is made up, that is scripted, that is like almost a sci-fi film where anything can happen and then anything does happen. And I'm very sad about that because I think that it's damaged our parliamentary democracy. I think that it's brought politics into disrepute, and I think it's created anger on all sides, whether people were strongly in favour of remaining or whether they were, as we call them, Brexiteers.
Absolutely. And given that situation, whether it's going to be a general election, many people are beginning to worry about how apathy taking effect.
Well, I'm worried about two things. Apathy in the respect of turnout and whether people vote, and anger and, if you like, the friction developed into a failure to be able to have a democratic dialogue, so that the respect that we have for each other, that the way in which we debate issues is often now broken down, and there's abuse in the street, not just of people because they're considered to be different or foreign, but because people recognize they have a different point of view. Now, that is new. I've been around in formal politics now for, goodness, almost all my adult life, because I was elected to a local authority in my city of Sheffield when I was 22. And I've never seen that. I've seen people get very annoyed, and that's fine, and people should get angry, but I've never experienced them display it in such personal venom before. And we need to calm that, because our democracy depends on people being able to have genuine disagreements and differences and to work them through the political process. Otherwise, we fall, as history teaches us, into the hands of extremists.
Absolutely. And given that you've just said what you just said, a lot of people are talking now about whether the party structure, which does exist at the minute, it can survive. We've seen both the Labour Party and the Conservative Party showing signs of buckling.
I think the political system the party system will survive. It may have a very rocky time in the near future, but I think it'll right itself. But it will only do that if political parties themselves sort out what's going on internally. I think both major parties have been, to use an old phrase, infiltrated. Came across a prominent minister just outside the cabinet whose current chair of their Conservative Association was the UKIP candidate against him back in 2015. We know about the challenges within the Labour Party and the way in which people who were thrown out of the party have either been able to or are seeking to rejoin. And so we've got this two-ender, if you like, the bread at the two sides of the sandwich coming together, and the middle is being squeezed. Now, there's academic work to say that actually the electorate aren't all that keen on centre parties, particularly at the moment. And I think we need to be wary of believing that the creation of some sort of centrist party in Britain would solve the problem. It would temporarily, but it wouldn't resolve the differences that people have and how we work them through.
A lot of people have been suggesting recently that the only way out of this situation is with a second referendum. And I write in saying that you have quite reluctantly come to that position yourself.
It took me a very long time to come to the conclusion that we would need an affirmative vote. I resisted it because I come from and represented an area deeply disaffected, feeling the effects of deindustrialization and then the austerity measures on the back of the global meltdown, and felt in my bones, which is why I wasn't one of those who thought we were easily going to win the referendum for Remain in 2016, that you need to deal with the underlying problems and causes of that disaffection. And the simple slogan, "They didn't hear you the first time, tell them again," could be very effective, a kind of Trumpian slogan that could be adopted by those who are very, very vehement Brexiteers. However, I think given the state that we're in, I came to the conclusion a few weeks ago, and I wrote in the Daily Telegraph, that I think the only way to deal with this is to get an agreement for this interim period, because that's what it is, a transition from where we are to where we might be, and then put that to the British people. And if the British people don't like that negotiated agreement, either Theresa May's original or something that emerges from the discussions and the debate and the toing and froing between the two major parties, put that to the electorate and give them a chance 3 years on from 2016 to make a new choice as to whether that's what they want to go for, that's the direction they want to take, or whether they'd like to take a step back and remain in the European Union.
And do you think that the people of Sheffield that did vote leave, many of whom voting for the first time in decades or the first time ever, do you think that they would feel maybe slightly frustrated at the call for a second vote?
Yes, I think they would. And I think we just have to be really honest about that. There would be a great deal of frustration, bordering on anger, people saying, we gave you the message, why didn't you just do it? And we have to be straight with them. The reason it's been complex, the reason it's taken this time, the reason that we are in the undoubted mess we're in, is because it wasn't simple. You didn't, as some people thought, sign a bit of paper and walk away. This is a complex, interconnected, economically, socially, in terms of our trade and our relationships, not just within the European Union, but with the European Union's agreements across the world. This is a complex issue. And to pretend otherwise is not to give people what they want, it's to patronize them and say, yes, we don't think you were wrong. We don't think that you got it wrong when you thought it was a simple way out. I think you just have to be straight with them, and they'll be angry. I mean, people are angry with me when I walk around in my own constituency and say, what are you up to? And I say, I'm up to trying to speak the truth. I'm up to trying to say it as it is, as I always have done.
Absolutely. Now, given all of that, one would expect the governing party to perhaps be somewhere between 20 points and to 30 points behind the opinion polls, but they are not. There has been an awful lot of criticism of the leadership of the opposition regarding that. Would you have any advice for the leadership of your party?
Well, I think belatedly, from the beginning of April, the two parties realised that they were going to sink separately if they didn't actually try and make an effort and at least display some endeavour to work together. I think had there been two different leaders post-2016 referendum, this would have happened a great deal earlier. It hasn't, but it can now. And it is remarkable that in the circumstances that the government have found themselves, not just in not being able to get the kind of deal that some people wanted, but even being able to hold all their party together, but actually being totally riven publicly with cabinet responsibility having broken down, to find themselves only marginally behind, or even on opinion polls through March, marginally in front of the Labour Party, is astonishing. And once this period is over, I think Labour will need to take a very long, hard look at why the British people have not turned, as they often do, to what is called Her Majesty's opposition. There are very complex reasons for that, including the fact that the leadership of the party have only realised, I think, very, very recently, that you have to reach out to people whose views you don't agree with, and you have to win them over to something more than the issues and the policies and the ideology you thought of in the first place.
And on that point, you'll be aware, certainly, that the Parliamentary Review itself has been dedicated to showcasing leadership in all its forms across the country. Now, speaking to many of our contributors, they have made clear that they do feel that leadership has been lacking, both from the government and opposition, as you've said. In your many years in politics, is there a time in certainly recent history where there has been perhaps a leadership vacuum like we're seeing today?
I think we find in Britain an interesting paradox. People want strong leaders, but they want leaders that listen and are responsive and the two don't always go together. I've lived through the period of both Margaret Thatcher and Tony Blair, two leaders who knew what they wanted to do and were prepared to put it on the line. I've lived through Ted Heath and John Major, who were less clear. Ted Heath on Europe, yes, but not on much else. John Major really trying to mop up after the controversial and divisive Thatcher era, where they showed a different style of leadership. Now, they were portrayed as being weak. I don't think that's always the case. I think that you can have leaders who are very clear what they want to do, but to turn on its head the Marxist slogan, speak softly and walk with a big stick, they can actually do the job clearly and decisively. Clem Attlee was such a person, and in many ways so is Harold Macmillan. And those are the kind of leaders where you don't get bombast, you don't get, I know best and I'm going to push this through, but you actually get someone who can genuinely create a coalition of the willing, but has a clear idea about their values. And I hope we'll return to that.
Absolutely. And I think one of the strengths of the review has always been its sense of bipartisanship.
Well, I think Parliamentary Review does something very interesting. It provides a platform for people to share and express their views, and I hope we're going to be able to build on that even more so that people can interconnect with each other. But it also gives an opportunity for parliamentarians to know that people are taking interest in what they're doing and how they're doing it, and therefore to get the message that they've got to reflect outwards. We need both. We need the input into the system. We need voices. We need ideas. We need experiences through Parliamentary Review inwards, but we also need to ensure that the way in which our politics works is reflected outwards, so that people firstly understand how the system works, secondly, the complexity and difficulty of it, and thirdly, the way in which they need to tell us, I mean, I'm in the upper house now, but to tell us as parliamentarians what they think and where we're going wrong, and for us to listen.
Absolutely. And on that point, you've been in public service for most of your life, Lord Blunkett, ever since Sheffield City Council. I mean, in that time, what are the key lessons you think you've learned in the best way for policymakers and those at the coalface to communicate and work together?
I've learned that actually there is enormous wisdom out there, and if you're prepared to engage and to listen, then your views might actually change. Mine have on a number of issues, particularly social issues, what small L liberal issues over the years, going in the opposite direction, it has to be said, to most people as they age. And you need to ensure that you've reached out to sufficient people to create that coalition that allows you to make progress, and that you won't create everything you want and change everything you want for the better overnight. It will never happen. There's no days where everything's done and we can all wash our hands of it. That's fine. We build building blocks. We stand, if you like, historically on the shoulders of those who came before us. And if we get that message, we won't be too frustrated when everything doesn't happen immediately, but we'll be determined to make progress, and we'll punish politically, democratically, those who don't.
Absolutely. And perhaps finally, with that concluding point, it's fair to say, as you've already mentioned, a lot of the population are frustrated, no matter how they vote in the referendum or their general political opinions. But perhaps, for those people, is there something you'd point to be optimistic, looking towards the future about?
I think I'm very clear. We're a great nation. We can't just do things on our own. We have to recognise that we live in an incredibly rapidly growing global environment, and the power sources and the power politically has changed over the last 20, 30 years. But we are creative, we are innovative, and we will pull through, and we'll do it because we won't have anyone else to blame anymore if we come out of the European Union, and we'll need to literally pull our socks up and do it ourselves. In the end, my message is clear. nothing is ever as good as it seems at the time, and nothing is ever as bad. And we've come through difficult times in the past, and we'll come through again.
Lord Blunkett, thank you very much.
Thank you, Jonathan.
As always, it's been a pleasure interviewing and learning from our guests. I hope you all enjoyed listening. Until next time, I'm off to St Stephen's Tavern to raise a glass to raising standards. Goodbye.
Thank you very much for listening to our podcast. You can find every episode on iTunes, YouTube, and Spotify. The views expressed by guests in each podcast are their own. They do not represent the opinions of the Parliamentary Review, Westminster Publications, Lord Pickles, Lord Blunkett, David Curry, or any other guests on the podcast. If you'd like to know more about the Parliamentary Review, please visit our website at www.theparliamentaryreview.co.uk.